The US has vetoed all 3 resolutions at the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. That's since Israel launched its war in October. So is Washington misusing its veto power? And does the Council's voting system need to change? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. 5 months of Israeli strikes on Gaza, and the United Nations has failed to adopt a resolution calling for a ceasefire. 3 votes have been held at the Security Council, but the United States has vetoed them all. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has described the veto as an instrument that's paralysed the Council from taking action on the Strip. That's a sentiment that Palestine's ambassador to the UN has also voiced, saying that American vetoes have cost Palestinians their lives. The US is one of only 5 permanent members that can veto resolutions, and it's accused of misusing it. Is use of the veto a hindrance to decision-making in the UN Security Council, and does it only serve the agenda of a select group of countries? We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first a report from Sharif.
In October, the United States vetoed an Arab-backed and widely supported UN Security Council resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. 13 of the 15-member council voted in favour, but the United Kingdom abstained, and the US said the initiative would interfere with negotiations on a deal to free captives and instead proposed a rival draft.
We look forward to engaging on a text that we believe will address so many of the concerns we all share, a text that can and should be adopted by the Council so that we can have a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable based on the formula of all hostages being released. This temporary ceasefire is critical to getting aid into the hands of Palestinian civilians who desperately need it.
Since Israel's war on Gaza started in October, the US has vetoed 3 ceasefire resolutions at the Council. The UK abstained during all 3 votes. Russia abstained in October. The UN Security Council has 10 elected members and 5 permanent members who wield veto powers. The US, UK, France, Russia and China were chosen as the permanent 5 after World War II. For it to adopt a resolution, at least 9 votes are required in favour and no vetoes by any of the permanent members. The US's rejections for calls for a ceasefire in Gaza is raising questions about the unilateral power of these countries.
As long as the Security Council is paralysed and vetoes casted, then it is costing the Palestinian people their lives. There is no way except a ceasefire to be put in place. And even I said to the ambassador of the United States that there is nothing that can prevent you, if you have clout over Israel, have a unilateral ceasefire put in place for as long as you want. You don't need a resolution in the Security Council.
Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 30,000 Palestinians in the past 5 months. Relentless Israeli airstrikes and ground operations have displaced most of its 2.4 million people, and they have little, if any, access to food, water, medicine and shelter. The World Health Organization is warning of famine and outbreaks of disease. But despite the growing humanitarian crisis, the UN Security Council has failed to unite on calling for an immediate ceasefire. Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our panel of experts. From New York, we're joined by Richard Gowan, the UN Director of the International Crisis Group, the think tank providing analysis of global conflict for policymakers and academics. From Montreal, we're joined by Moan Rabbani, who's a non-resident fellow at the Centre for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. He's worked on Palestinian issues with UN agencies. And joining us from Deganwy in Wales is Khan Ross, a former UK diplomat at the UN. He's currently working on the upcoming UN Summit of the Future. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Richard, let's start with you. Is the UN Security Council fit for purpose in 2024? What was the thinking back in 1945 when it was decided to have these 5 permanent seats on the Council? And to what extent is the war on Gaza now forcing the Security Council to run up against its geopolitical limitations?
Well, the Security Council has never truly fulfilled its original purpose. It was meant to be a global policing agency. And the US, the Soviets, the British, and the other permanent members were meant to be the 5 policemen who would hold crises in check and avoid a return to major power war. Ever since the 1940s, the Council has failed to live up to that vision because of tensions between the big powers. There was a period after 1989 when cooperation improved considerably, but the Council still failed over Rwanda and over Bosnia. And I think what we're seeing today over Ukraine, over Gaza, but also over other cases like Myanmar, is that tensions involving the US, involving the Russians, and involving the Chinese are really hobbling this organization, which I think is sadly inevitable given the very tense state of global politics today.
Mohan Rabbani, does the world need these 5 policemen, as Richard put it, the parental supervision of 5 world powers, 2 of which you could argue are not nearly as powerful as they once were? To what extent should Security Council membership be about values, not just about power?
Well, I think as Richard mentioned, the Security Council reflects the world as it existed in 1945, and it has failed to evolve since then for the simple reason that Security Council reform is an incredibly complex process which requires the consent of those who stand to gain the least from any change. And therefore we can, I think, have a discussion proposing all kinds of manner in which a Security Council could operate more effectively and more efficiently. But I also think we have to recognize that the chances of this happening are exceedingly small. And now with Israel's war on the Gaza Strip, I think that the UN, or at the very least the Security Council, is facing its Abyssinia moment. That time in the 1930s when the League of Nations failed to confront Italy's aggression against Ethiopia because those on the receiving end of aggression were too dark to have any concern in what was then the international community. And I think what we're seeing is increasingly the international community seeking remedies outside and beyond the scope of the Security Council, most recently with South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice, General Assembly resolutions, which are non-binding, but yet, and I think the relevance of the Security Council is diminishing with every passing day.
Khan Ross, should any nation have the power to veto decisions made by a majority of the others at the UN in general, not just the Security Council? I mean, why isn't the Global South given a much more influential voice on the Security Council? Why don't India and Brazil have a permanent seat? Countries in Africa, why aren't they represented permanently on the Security Council?
Well, the simple answer is they didn't win the Second World War. It was the victors of the Second World War who decided the machinery of the United Nations and determined that the 5 of them, the current permanent 5, would have a veto in order to protect their interests. Richard Gowan is entirely right that they were set up as kind of global policemen, but the veto was to protect their interests. And they are not going to give that up anytime soon. There has been literally decades of debate about reform of the UN Security Council, debate which is really coming to a head at the moment because of what is happening in Gaza and the US veto of ceasefire resolutions, but also because the Russians have vetoed resolutions on Ukraine in a similar way. There seems to be broad consensus that Africa needs more representation, Asia too, perhaps with India joining as a permanent member, and Brazil from Latin America. But the trouble with reform is that nobody can agree which countries should become new permanent members. So there are ideas of semi-permanent members, things like that, to try to get around this. But the basic problem at the moment is that each of the prospective permanent members, like India, Brazil, etc., has very fierce opposition from other countries. So there is no consensus on who should join a reformed Security Council.
And Khan, why does the Security Council need permanent members at all? Why can't it all be just done on a rotating or democratic basis?
Democratic doesn't really fit with the UN. It's not a democratic organ. It is a body of states, many of which are not democratic. The General Assembly is a place where things are debated and motions are passed according to a majority or a two-thirds majority. But the Security Council is different, above all because the resolutions that it passes, the decisions that it makes, are obligatory on all 193 member states of the UN. So that gives it an extraordinary importance, which the General Assembly, or arguably a more democratic body, at least in state terms, it gives it a power that the General Assembly does not have. And as Richard Gowan said, the Permanent Five are not going to give up their power to block obligatory decisions on the rest of the world. That is not going to happen anytime soon.
Why, though? Richard, why isn't that going to happen anytime soon?
Well, because, quite frankly, for the US, China, and Russia, this is a very happy situation to be in. And there you have three powers with huge differences, but nonetheless, they have a common interest in maintaining control over the UN system in the way that Khan describes. I mean, I think it is worth saying that we are seeing the wider UN membership both demanding reform in a way we haven't really heard for at least 20 years since the Iraq War. And secondly, we're seeing the General Assembly becoming more active. And the General Assembly has spoken out and passed resolutions on both Ukraine and Gaza, which express the frustration of most UN members with the way the Security Council is working now. So there is a bit of an uprising, but the rules of the UN Charter make it very clear that the current permanent five members have to agree to any small change to the Charter, such as deleting the veto or changing the composition of the Security Council. So at the end of the day, Washington and Moscow and Beijing can prevent any reforms that they find uncomfortable.
Richard, in September, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that a great fracture in the global governance system was looming. What did he mean by that? What's the mood among diplomats at the UN? Are they as frustrated with the organization's ability to respond to crises as the rest of us?
Yes, I mean, one thing that I hear from diplomats from all blocs, all groups in New York, is that they increasingly struggle to convince their political masters back in their capitals that the UN really matters. I think there is a feeling amongst Western nations that the UN has shown profound limitations over Ukraine, and there's certainly a feeling around the world that the UN has shown profound limitations over Gaza. And so a lot of diplomats sitting in Midtown Manhattan, do sense that they are pretty marginal to world affairs now, and that leaves a pretty sour mood around the organization. I think that Antonio Guterres, when he talked about a great fracture, was actually envisaging even broader problems. I think Guterres sees that there are issues about power not only in the Security Council, but also in other multilateral bodies such as the World Bank and IMF. And Guterres worries that if the current big powers don't at least allow some reform, don't give up a little bit of their authority, then you're just going to see a lot of countries drifting away from the multilateral system altogether, because it's so clearly biased and also so frequently ineffective.
Mohan Robadi, coming back to what you were saying about the chances of reform being extremely small, is the age of multilateralism dead?
I wouldn't say so. I think we're beginning to see different forms of multilateralism. And I think you're beginning to see two developments. The first is, for example, the establishment and expansion of BRICS as alternatives or supplements to the existing multilateral system. And the others is you're seeing increasing tensions between the Western designed rules-based international order on the one hand, and international law and the will of the international community on the other. And I think this is being expressed very clearly, for example, in the very different resolutions that are being adopted or not adopted by the Security Council on the one hand, and the General Assembly on the other. And I should add, we've been talking a lot about the use and abuse of the veto by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And that's an entirely appropriate discussion to have. But I think we also need to look at those resolutions that have been adopted and that are being violated even by the permanent 5 or some of the permanent 5 members. So, for example, the United States relocated its embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, an open and direct and brazen violation of a Security Council resolution from, I believe, 1980, calling upon member states to remove their diplomatic missions from Jerusalem. You know, the latest Security Council resolution calling upon states to observe distinction in their dealings with Israel, between Israel and the occupied territories, is primarily honored in the breach. So I think the problem, again, as my colleagues have been saying, goes much deeper than simply the Security Council and the use and abuse of the veto.
Khan, how then do you, I mean, we've got this seemingly intractable problem here. It's almost impossible to reform the UN Security Council, given the permanent members not wanting to give ground the UN Charter we discussed. Somehow, you know, if a majority of nations want it, some reform is going to have to happen. We talked at the beginning of the programme about the UN Summit of the Future that you're working on. Is anything likely to come out of that? Tell us about what that summit aims to do.
Sure. I mean, just a quick comment on what Maureen said. I mean, there are some multilateral successes. For instance, I mean, I find it remarkable that 193 member states are able to agree on climate change, biodiversity, things like that. So there is some life left in the multilateral system. The UN Summit of the Future was called by the Secretary General to discuss the future of multilateralism, future global institutions. It's happening this September at the most senior head of state level. And it is supposed to cover everything from sustainable development to the governance of outer space to Security Council reform. And what we're seeing, what I'm hearing talking to diplomats, is that there is a real appetite to do something on Security Council reform. Everybody knows it's really intractable, but maybe they can agree, for instance, to have a deadline on agreeing reform. There is already an intergovernmental discussion happening at the UN, which in theory could produce some proposals for reform. So you could put that deadline on those actually being agreed at the UN, and they need a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly to alter the Charter. And then, as others have been saying, they need to be ratified by particularly the P5 themselves. And I would note also their legislatures. So whatever reform we might see proposed at the UN would then have to be ratified by the US Congress. And I'm sure your viewers can imagine how difficult that might be. But the UN Summit of the Future is a particular moment. It's supposed to be a kind of generational moment to discuss global governance. So inevitably, Security Council reform is on the table.
So what will the outcome document from this Summit of the Future look like, Khan? Is it going to be a fudge at the end of the day?
Well, all international agreements are fudges of various kinds. Getting 193 countries to agree anything is pretty remarkable. And so far, what I'm seeing is that we will get 193 countries to agree this text. At the moment, there's an outcome text under negotiation. It's pretty awful. It's lowest common denominator stuff. But I actually think there is an opportunity here for a group of moderate, right-thinking, progressive states to introduce some really thoughtful, ambitious reforms that, I mean, I'm a negotiator. I think you give things a go. Maybe you get them through, maybe you don't. Though, on the other hand, one ambassador has said to me, getting anything agreed in this moment of great geopolitical tension and confrontation would be remarkable.
Richard, in what state is the US's diplomatic standing right now at the UN? Since Israel launched its war on Gaza, the US, as we've said, has found itself increasingly isolated in both the General Assembly and the Security Council.
I think that US diplomats are entirely aware that they have lost a huge amount of goodwill over the past months because of their stance on Gaza. And I think that is very frustrating for US officials in the Biden administration who had actually spent the last couple of years working pretty hard, and I think reasonably successfully, to restore US credibility at the UN after the period of the Trump administration, when the US was a very disruptive player in New York. Now, of course, American diplomats now face two problems. One is that the White House continues to follow policies on Gaza that most UN members find profoundly mistaken. And then there is an election on the horizon. And diplomats in New York, they read the New York Times, they watch CNN, and they are very aware that Mr. Trump may come back. And 1 year from now, we may be looking at a isolationist, disruptive US at the UN that will be even harder to work with than the Biden team has been in recent months.
And what does the US, briefly, Richard, what does the US need to do to restore its credibility at the UN? Do you think, is it possible to do so?
Well, I think the shadow of Trump will make it very difficult for the Biden administration to fully regain credibility in the coming year. But there are things that the administration could do, starting obviously with supporting a ceasefire in Gaza and then using the mechanisms of the UN, including the Security Council, to support a ceasefire and perhaps recommit to the two-state solution. The US can also invest in the Summit of the Future that Khan has been describing. It can follow positive policies on other issues, such as supporting crisis management in Africa, which would win it back some goodwill. But at the end of the day, the issue is Gaza, and until there is a ceasefire in Gaza, the US is going to continue to struggle, I think, diplomatically in New York.
Muan Rabani, do you agree with that? I mean, can the US rebuild trust with with the wider UN community after the way in which it's behaved over Gaza?
Yes, I do agree with what was said, and I do think that this has been a rupture. I do think it can be legitimately compared to the League of Nations response to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. I'm sure Washington would love UN Security Council reform, provided the Security Council is reduced to 3 members, the US, the UK, and Israel. But that's also not on the agenda. And I think ultimately, once again, I think states will treat the Security Council as increasingly an obstacle to international order, to international cooperation, to international peace and security, and begin to seek solutions elsewhere, whether within the UN system, such as the General Assembly and other agencies, and if those fail to achieve results as well, increasingly outside the UN system, which I think would be very unfortunate, because the United Nations is the only truly global body we have, and it's being run into the ground primarily by those who are abusing the veto power in order to protect their own narrow self-interests and their closest allies.
Khan, do you agree with that? To what extent has the US's behaviour at the UN since October last year damaged the credibility of the organization as a whole?
Oh, I agree with the other panelists. It's definitely done enormous damage to the American reputation at the UN, their power to influence people on other decisions at the UN. The credibility over Ukraine, for instance, where Russia has vetoed resolutions at the UN Security Council. I mean, Russia has also brought the organization into disrepute, but what the US has done over Gaza, blocking ceasefire resolutions, has also undermined the Western position on Ukraine. So it's not a good picture. And I think we need a deep reaffirmation of some of the things the UN is about, particularly the illegality of war, because war is actually illegal, but for two very narrow circumstances: self-defense and when conflict, when armed forces authorized by the UN Security Council. And I hope that those values, although very much more honored in the breach today, will be reaffirmed. Likewise, the UN stands for some very important universal principles, such as human rights. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, arguably the most important agreement, albeit a normative, not a legal agreement, of the 20th century. These are standards that we must uphold. We cannot let this institution be eroded.
Richard, we've got about a minute left on the programme. How do you see the future for the UN? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Is the US going to maintain its status as first among equals among UN nations, its role as de facto leader, if you like?
I think that crises come and crises go, and I am sure that if all else was equal, when the war in Gaza finally ends, the US would be able to gradually rebuild some leadership, although I think facing continuing challenges from China and Russia. But I do come back to this point that if we have a second Trump administration, then we could see much greater ruptures and much greater dramas at the UN. And that really could mark the end of Washington's decades of multilateral leadership.
There, gentlemen, we must leave it. Many thanks indeed to you all for taking part in the programme today. Richard Gowan, Muan Rabbani and Khan Ross. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page, which you'll find at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story, from me, Adrian Finighan, and the team in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye now.